So today's daf is Lamed Daled. We are going to start 1, 2, 3, 4 lines from the top of the Amud, and it's a short daf today. We were discussing a case in which we were trying to understand why it was that according to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, according to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, he told us that if you have a basket hanging from the tree, and the basket is higher than 10 tefachim from the ground, so that's valid. You can put the Eruvei Techumin in this basket, and it can rest on the side of the tree, and it's not a problem. Right? But he said that if you placed it on the tree and it was higher than 10 tefachim, it wouldn't be good. So the question we had was, what is the difference? And so the first way that we resolved it was by saying, well, in one case he's talking about where the tree is very thick and it's a reshut hayachid, it's like a private domain, and in the case of the basket he's talking about where the tree itself is not thick enough to make a private domain, and therefore it's not considered to be in a different place than you are. Since you're at the base of the tree, you're in the public domain, it's considered to be with you, it's no problem. And we talked about how the branch is jutting out, so it's not close enough to you, and the whole thing. So now we're trying a different approach here, which is, the second interpretation was Rabbi Yirmiyah said that because a basket can be tilted, so even if it's higher than 10 tefachim, you can tilt the basket so that it's lower than 10 tefachim, and you are standing yourself in a public domain. So if it were in a private domain and you're in a public domain, then there's no way you can bring it to yourself. Right? But since it's in a public domain as well, because you could tilt it so that the opening of the basket is within 10 tefachim of the ground, and you can extract it from there, so we don't see the eruv as being in a different place than you are. So that's what Rabbi Yirmiyah said. So now we're working with this principle. So we had one objection to it. We resolved that objection, and now we're on a second objection. There is an objection to kaven l'shpot b'reshut harabim. Ve'hiniach eruvo bakotel lemata me'asar tefachim eruvo eruv lemala miyud tefachim en eruvo eruv. So it says if a person is in the reshut harabim, he's in the public domain, and he places his eruv on a wall. If he places it lower than 10 tefachim, it's okay. If it's higher than 10 tefachim, it's not okay. Why would it not be okay if it's higher than 10 tefachim? Because if it's higher than 10 tefachim, we're assuming that this wall is like a reshut hayachid. It has thickness of 4 tefachim. It's considered like a private domain. And if it is higher than 10 tefachim, it's considered to be in a private domain. You are actually in a public domain. The place that you're sitting is a public domain, so you can't get the food of the eruv to your spot. You wouldn't be able to get it. And that's why it would be considered problematic. If it's within 10 tefachim of the ground, it's in the same place that you are, it's in the Reshut HaRabim, and you'd be allowed to get it. Nitkaven lishpot b'rosh hashovach or b'rosh hamigdal. If a person decided to make his makom shevita, in other words, he establishes his Shabbat residence on top of a tower, or some kind of which could also be some kind of a closet or whatever it is, it's some kind of a structure. That's a large structure, or on top of a dovecote. In other words, the place where the doves would stay. You decide that on the roof of that is where you're going to make your a place of shevita. So lemala miyud tefachim eruvo eruv, lemata miyud tefachim en eruvo eruv. So here we have the opposite case. And you placed your eruv. Now there's two interpretations in Rashi here. So according to the first one, it goes like this. So you are on top of this dovecote, or on top of this migdal, on top of this structure, and you placed your eruv on the wall and the opening on the side of the structure. So let's see, I believe they have a drawing of this here. They must, right? Yeah. So here we go. We can look at number 169 is the case. So 169 is when it's in the wall. So it could either be on a high point of the wall or a low point. Second one is you are standing on here. You're going to be sitting on top of this structure. They make it like a dresser drawer, it looks like. You're on top of here. And they have it according to the second opinion of Rashi, which is the dresser drawer is next to the wall. So we're talking about the same wall that we were before. Okay? Now according to the first opinion of Rashi, the Gemara is discussing a case where you place the eruv somewhere on the side of the structure. But according to the second view, which is the one that he favors and the one that's depicted in the pictures, we're talking about where your structure is here. The item is in a hole in the wall. So this is the eruv food. Now if you say this is going to be my official position for Shabbat, here on top of this structure, which is next to the wall, okay, this whatever it is, this dresser, Okay, it's next to the wall. The food is actually in the wall. Okay, in the hole in the wall. So when you're just sitting next to the wall, so then if the food is higher than 10 tefachim, it's too far. If it's lower than 10 tefachim, it's okay. But if you're on top of the structure, then you're actually in a reshut hayachid. Right? Because you're on top of this. You're on top of a structure because it's big enough to make a reshut hayachid. That means that if the food in the wall is lower than 10 tefachim, it's a problem because it's considered to be in the public domain. If it's higher than 10 tefachim, then it's considered to be with you in another private domain.
But aren't you going from one private domain to another?
Yeah, but you're going in the space that's above the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim, so it would be okay. Since you'd be passing it from the wall onto the top of your dresser drawer or whatever you're sitting on, this structure, this big structure, so therefore you're passing it from one private domain to another, but you're passing it over the Reshut HaRabim, and it's too high for it to be a source of concern. That's how Rashi interprets the case in the second version, which is the version that he says is the correct version. In the long Rashi that starts kivtau mitna, so he says Lishna acharina shamati ve'ikam. That this is the second interpretation and it's ikar, it is the main interpretation, it's the primary interpretation, is the one that he's going to give at the end of this Rashi. So he gave another case where the food is actually in the side of the dresser. And then he had to explain that when it's taller than 10 tefachim, it's closer to where he is, and when it's below 10 tefachim, it's further away. Now we're dealing with two structures. So actually the food, according to the definitive accepted view of Rashi, the one that's depicted in the picture, so you're sitting on top of the structure, the food is in the wall. If the food is above 10 tefachim, it's better in this case. It's better in this case because you're in a private domain being on top of the structure, and you can reach it without having to venture into the public domain at all. And if it is below 10 tefachim, then technically it's actually within range of the public domain, especially if it's at the 9 tefach level. The 9 tefach level would be considered very much the public domain because 9 tefachim is where people would rest their bags if they were in the public domain. So the question is, ve'amai didn't you tell me, Rebbe Yirmiyah, that the reason why putting the eruv in a basket above 10 tefachim when it's hanging on a tree is okay is because you could tilt the basket. You could tilt it. You don't have to, but you could. So to here, can't you tilt the dresser? Right? The migdal literally means a tower, but it's talking about some kind of movable structure, right? So you could tilt this dresser to be within 10 tefachim. So tilt it. And then what would happen? Even though your food is in the side of the wall and it's what's considered to be in a public domain, in the public domain airspace, between 3 and 9 tefachim or whatever it is, even though it's in the side of the wall facing the public domain, you will tilt the dresser so that the spot you're sitting on is also under 10 tefachim, and then you and the food are both within the public domain airspace. Okay, so that would mean that what? You don't actually have to tilt it. The point is that if you were to take the food from where it is now onto where you're standing now, it would be an isur deoraita because you would be taking from what's considered a public domain. The side of that wall is considered a public domain when the food is lower than 10 tefachim, and you'd be taking it to where you're sitting, which is a private domain. But if you were to tilt your dresser so that where you're sitting is now lower than 10 tefachim, now both you and the food would be within the 10 tefachim. Of course, you would have to balance really well to be able to actually sit up there, but it doesn't matter. The point is, it's in hypothetically, if you could tilt it, then it would count.
But even hypothetically, in both those tiltings, the basket or the tower,
right?
Aren't you moving something that I know
you're moving the structure? You're moving the domain itself,
and that's
so it's okay. You're not moving. You're not considered to be moving it from one domain to another. You're moving the domain itself. It's okay.
So it's not.
No, it wouldn't be. But anyway, you don't even have to move it. It's only in hypothetics, right?
It's the bottom of the basket.
You're tilting it so it'll be lower.
Go up to,
it's the whole thing is above 10 tefachim, so you would have to tilt it so that the opening of it, you'll tilt it forward so that it will be facing down.
The opening has what part has to be under 10 tefachim? The opening.
The opening. You would have to be able to reach your food would have to be resting under 10 tefachim so you could get it.
So your hand has to be going under the tent of
Right, basically, pretty much. I mean, the food has to be under it, at least. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah will tell you, you're right. Good question. However, who said that this migdal, that this structure, this dresser, whatever it is mobile? Maybe it's attached. Maybe it's fixed to maybe it's attached to the wall. Maybe it's hammered, so you can't say it could be mobile, because how many it could have, maybe I could be a unicorn. I mean, how many I could have is it going to be? Right? So it could not be Shabbat today. And then we wouldn't have the problem. Right? So how many I could have are you going to use? So if it's attached to the wall, that's too many I could have. Okay? And that's what that's what the Mefarshim basically say. There's only so many hypotheticals we can invoke here. So he says when it's a loose thing that could actually be moved, fine. And Rava says, Amar afilu tema b'migdal she'eno misumar. Even a migdal that isn't attached to the wall and hammered to the wall. However, migdal aroch askinan, but we're talking about a very tall structure. It's a long, tall dresser. So therefore, because what will happen is that if you were to tilt it, then where you would be sitting would be now further than 4 amot from where the food is. The food, remember, is in the wall. Remember the picture. So the food is in the wall. You are, in theory, your makom shebita, your place of rest, which doesn't mean you physically have to be there. But in other words, your assigned place of rest is on top of the dresser. So if you were to try to reach it, in other words, if you were to bend this, so what will happen is, so here's the attached one. The attached one is 172. This is the idea of tilting it, since you could tilt it, the angle in 171. Okay? In 172 it shows you the hammered one to the wall. This one is a tall one that's so tall that if you were to tilt it, either the problem is that you would end up being over here. Once you're under 10 tefachim, you would be 4 amot from the food. So anyway, you wouldn't be able to access it because you can't carry 4 amot in a public domain either. Okay, or it means that if you were to tilt it, this would be 4 amot away from its original location, and you can't move your makom shevita 4 amot. It's so tall that if you were to move it from here to here, this is 4 amot, it would no longer be within 4 amot of its original location. You'd be moving your makom shevita to do that. So either way, the point
is considered moving even if the legs are still there.
Because you would have to tilt it. So
that's
your makom shevita is just the top part of the dresser. So when you tilt it, it's actually moving out of the 4 amah range that you originally had.
Oh, in other words, you're moving
the top part. Yeah, the top part. So the point is that either the problem is that by the time you tilt it, it's so long that by the time you tilt it, now the head of it will be 4 amot away from the food, or it will be 4 amot from the place that it originally was. Either way, you'll be messing up the case. Okay, but Rava is saying if it were a short one, then sure, you could tilt it and it might work. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says, yeah, you could tilt it and it might work as long as it's not hammered to the wall. Okay, as long as there's no other logistical problem. But the logistical problem here is that either it's attached to the wall, or it's so tall that if you were to move it, you would be disrupting your ability to reach it. Because we know you can't take from a public to your whole goal here is to make both your makom shevita and the food both in the public domain. But you can't carry 4 amot in a public domain either. If they're right next to each other, that's one thing. You'd be able to reach it. But if they're going to be so distant that you couldn't carry from there, then it won't help you. So let's take a look at the case again. If we're talking about a case where there's a rope and a window here, so then you'd be able to take it with the rope and the window. Okay, so what it means is, again, and they show you a picture again in the back, and this would be illustration number 170. What was it? 173? I can't remember now. 174. That you see that in the migdal there's a hole in the side and there's a rope attached. So you're on top of the migdal. You're on top of the dresser. You're holding the rope in your hand. The other side of the rope is attached to the bread. Okay, you are in a private domain. It is in a public domain. The bread is really in a public domain.
Where are you? You're here.
You're on top of here.
You're here.
The bread is over here. Because the bread is in a public domain, you're in a private domain. Now, you couldn't carry it from here to here. But since it's attached to a rope. The rope that's in your hand, you're in the private domain holding a rope. Like imagine you're holding, you have a bag with a rope, and the bag is in the public domain, and you're in the private domain, and you're holding the bag, you're holding the rope of the bag in the private domain. So if you were to pull it into the private domain, that's not an Isur Deoraita, because you didn't fully transfer it, because part of the item was in the private domain all along. The rope was. So in this case, since there's a hole in the side of the dresser so that you could have a rope that descends down from the top of the dresser, out the side of the dresser, and is tied around the eruv, technically you could say that it's with you all along. So of course,
what the well, where you're outside the window and you have a well and you pull
it's similar to that, but that's more complicated. But yeah, but so here though, he says, so obviously our conclusion is that there isn't a hole in the thing and there isn't a rope, that's all. So everybody would agree, apparently, if you had some kind of way of alleviating the problem and making it only an Isur Derabanan. That's been the goal the whole time. If we can make whatever prohibition would be involved in getting that food to you only a rabbinic prohibition, then we're okay, because we know Bein HaShemashot, rabbinic prohibitions are suspended, or they don't apply. So if we can, so in this case, if you had a rope attached to the eruv, even though the eruv is in a public domain, and you are on top of your migdal in a private domain, but since you're holding a rope that is, connecting you to that eruv, and technically, if you were to pull it through, it would only be an Isur Derabanan, not an Isur Deoraita, so then you would be okay. So the Gemara says, of course, we're talking about a case where that doesn't apply. If that did apply, it would be a different story. Okay, so that's how we've solved the case. Now, we come to the next case. It said in the Mishnah that you could put your eruv in a bor, in a pit or a cistern that goes down even 100 amot deep. It's a private domain, a pit in the ground. So the Gemara says, "Hi bor dekai hecha. Where is this bor situated? Where is this hole situated? If you're telling me that it's in your backyard is fenced, and there's a huge pit in your backyard, okay, or there's an enclosed area and there's a huge pit in it, so it's really in a private domain. So pshita reshut yachid ole ad rakia v'chi yachid desal kala el hachinamid nahta letahat. That's the fact is that a reshut yachid goes up infinitely and down infinitely. So even if you had a pit that went down 10 miles into the ground, it wouldn't matter, because as long as the entrance to that pit is in a Reshut Yachid, it's a Reshut Yachid. Up to the sky, it's a Reshut Yachid. If you're within the boundaries of the Reshut Yachid, it goes up infinitely, it goes down infinitely. So that's not a Chidush. Of course, you could put the Eruv inside the pit. You're in a Reshut Yachid, it's in a Reshut Yachid. No problem. It doesn't matter how deep it is. Ve'ela dekai b'reshut harabim. Rather, you're going to tell me that you put your eruv in a pit in the reshut harabim. Tenitkaven lishbotecha. So where were you planning to make your makom shavita? Because remember, there are two things. We have to determine where is your place for Shabbat. What are you saying is your place, and where are you putting your provisions? Okay, it's two questions. So where is your place? So if you're telling me that your idea was, my makom shavita is in the public domain at this spot, I'm going to put my food deep into this pit, which is a private domain. So obviously that's no good. The food is in a private domain, you're in a public domain. You'll tell me, well, no problem, I can always go into the private domain and eat it down in the pit. But the fact is, your place of residence has to have access to that food. It has to be food that could get to that place. And since you said, my makom shvita, my place of residence is in the Reshut Harabim, the food is in the Reshut Yachid, it doesn't matter that you could go down into the Reshut Yachid and eat it. That doesn't help you.
So in other words, it has to rest in a public space.
It needs to be in a public space if you're in a public space, and it has to be within 4 amot of you if you're in a public space. Because it needs to be able to get to the makom shavita. Now, the one question that could be raised here is, what about, and Rashi and Tosafot bring up this issue, is carrying less than 4 amot in a public domain is only rabbinically prohibited. So even if there was a distance of more than 4 amot between, let's say, your eruv and your makom shavita, you should be, even if it's more than 4 amot rather in the public domain, you should be able to say, well, rabbinically, I'm not allowed to do this, but biblically I could walk 1 amah, stop, 1 walk amah, stop, 1, right? You can do less than 4 amot at a time. So that's not included. So in one place, Rashi seems to say that that's something that even Rabbeinu HaKadosh wouldn't allow you to do, because it's too close to the biblical melacha of carrying. And in another place, Rashi seems to say that would be okay, that he entertains the possibility that it would be okay, even if it's very far in the Reshut Rabim. So that's a question that it's unclear what the resolution is. But anyway, so the answer must be then, so if he decides that my makom shvita is in the pit, and the food is in the pit, it's no problem. If he says my makom shvita is outside the pit, and the food is in the pit, then it is a problem. There's no way to get the food to the makom shvita. So what's the chidush here? Lo tzricha b'dekai b'karmelit v'nitkaven lishbot lemala v'Rabbi Hidamar kol davar shu mishum shivut lo gazru alav ben hashemashot. So obviously the case is where this pit is situated in a karmelit. A karmelit is a place that is not enclosed. It's rabbinically prohibited to carry. For one reason or another, it's rabbinically prohibited to carry. And since it's rabbinically prohibited to carry, between the pit is a Reshut HaYachid. It's rabbinically prohibited to carry to and from a Karmelit and a Reshut HaYachid and a private domain. And it's rabbinically prohibited to carry to and from a public domain and a Karmelit. And it's rabbinically prohibited to carry in a Karmelit for Amot. So we attach to it the stringencies of both the Reshut HaYachid and a Reshut HaRabim rabbinically, even though biblically it's actually nothing. It's what we call the Shabbat equivalent of Parov. It doesn't have any status. But we're giving it all the statuses in order to prevent people from getting confused, because in certain ways the Carmelit is similar to a private domain, and in certain ways it's similar to a public domain, and it's easy to get mixed up. So in this case we're talking about where the pit has your Eruv in it, and the surrounding area is a Carmelit. So it's rabbinically prohibited to take the food from inside the bor and to bring it into the Carmelit. But rabbinic prohibitions, according to Rabbi, when the sun goes down, before the stars come out, are still permitted. So therefore, it would be okay to set your Eruv up in that way, because it's only rabbinically prohibited to move the food to your place of residence. The new Mishnah says, Nitano berosh hakaneh. Oh, berosh hakundas. If a person were to put their eruv on top of a reed or on top of a pole, bazman shu talush v'na'utz, if it's something that's already been taken out of the ground and replanted, that's okay. Afilu gavoa kuf ama hariz eruv. Even if it's 100 amot tall, it's still an eruv. So let's say you have a reed that was already taken out of the ground, and you took this reed that's been already detached from the ground, but you stuck it into the dirt again as a pole, and you put your eruv on top of it, and you did that obviously because you want people to take it, or whatever the reason is.
And the reason is because the pole is not itself a private domain, and therefore
it won't create a private domain.
It won't create a private domain, and therefore it's still in the...
If the reed's still alive and growing.
The reed is not alive. We're assuming it's not.
It matters.
We're going to see. So Rami le Rav Adabar Matana Rava. Rav Adabar Matana raised an objection to Rava. Talush v'na'utz in lo, talush v'na'utz lo. Our Mishnah says that if the reed was detached from the ground and re-stuck into the ground, then yes. If not, if it was naturally in its natural place of growth, you can't go up to a reed that's naturally growing there and just put your food on top of it. That would not be allowed. Mani Rabbananhi, this must reflect the opinion of the rabbis. The Amrei kol davar shumishum shivut gazru alav ben hashemashot. This follows the opinion of the rabbis. Why? Because the rabbis say that, because according to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, what would be the problem of you taking a reed that's currently growing and using that as a base to put your food? What would the problem be? Can't you take things to and from a tree? Isn't that only rabbinically prohibited? Right? It's only rabbinically prohibited to take things to and from a tree that are resting on the tree. And Rabbi had said before that if the eruv is sitting on a tree, it's okay because it's only rabbinic to remove something from the tree.
Probably because when you remove it, you might actually.
Wait, hold on, don't jump ahead. Right. Okay, so far we know you're not allowed to lean on it, you're not allowed to touch it, right? So therefore, when it's on the tree, Rabbi said, well, it's rabbinically prohibited to take it off, but we overlook rabbinic prohibitions when it comes to where to place your tichum. Correct? Okay, so here when it comes to the reed, but this seems to follow the rabbis, because it's saying you can't put your food on a naturally growing reed. Rabbi would allow you to do that, because he would say, okay, so what's the big deal? It's resting on a reed, you'll take it off, and taking it off is only rabbinically prohibited. You're not allowed to take it off, but since it's only rabbinically prohibited, therefore the eruv is still valid. Because something that there's only a rabbinic prohibition preventing you from accessing it on Shabbat, even though you can't actually access it, it's still valid insofar as eruv is concerned.
Did he say that about a tree, a basket?
He was talking about a basket in a tree, or putting it actually on the branch of the tree.
He always said that was okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It was okay because you can't actually take it off on Shabbat.
Why?
You can't take the food off of the tree because you're not allowed to use the tree, lean on it, and whatever. But since it's only rabbinically prohibited,
You're not allowed to lean on it
a tree.
rabbinically.
Okay. That's why you're not allowed to put your food to rest on it and all that. Rabbinically, you wouldn't be allowed to take the food off, but since it's only rabbinic, he says that that's not enough to prevent the eruv from working. Okay? But here, the Mishnah is saying you can't put it on a reed. So if you can't put it on a reed, that means that we're following the rabbis who say that even if there's only a rabbinic prohibition standing in the way of you and your eruv, it's invalid. So the Gemara answers that, the difficulty continues. But the first half of the Mishnah, because our Mishnah breaks it up into two, our Gemara breaks it up into two. But the first part that talked about putting it in the tree, there you said that we followed Rabbi. It was following Rabbeinu HaKadosh because it said that you could put it in the tree and that it wasn't an issue that it's rabbinically prohibited to take it off the tree. And now you're saying that it is an issue that it's rabbinically prohibited to take it off the reed. And you won't let us use a reed. So the beginning is following Rabbi and the end is following the rabbis. So the Gemara says, yeah, that's right. Amarle said. So he said to him, Amarle kvar ramile Rami bar Chama Rav Chisda v'shanele. That Rami bar Chama already asked this to Rav Chisda, and he answered him, Reisha Rabbi v'sefa Rabbanan, that the beginning is Rabbi and the end is Rabbanan. In other words, the case of the tree is following Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and the case of the reed is reflecting the opinion of the rabbis. But really, but Rabbi would agree that you could use the reed. You could put your food on a tall reed. It wouldn't be a problem. The Gemara says, Ravina disagrees. Says, Kula Rabbihi v'sefa gezeram shema yiktom. Actually, no. Even Rabbi would agree that you can't use a reed. He said yes for a tree, but no for a reed. Why not? Because reeds are delicate. And the concern is that you're not going to break the tree branch off. That's a rabbinic prohibition that's somewhat remote, that you're going to actually break the tree. But a reed, it's very close to coming to an Isur Deoraita. So Rashi says that that we're concerned you might break it. So he says, Aval ilan kashehu ben shloshot l'shema yalavit lo shlo chayshinan aval iktimat kaneh vadai hi I did the rakicha mikdema, that when it comes to a tree, we're not really concerned. It's only a rabbinic prohibition, and we wouldn't apply it during twilight. That you're going to uproot a branch. But a reed is so delicate, it's so easily removable that we wouldn't allow you to make use of a reed. Even the rabbis would uphold their gezerah in that case because it's so close to actually violating the prohibition. It's almost vadai. It's almost for certain that you're going to uproot a reed if you're using it to hold food. It's not going to be sturdy enough, and it's easily going to become dislodged.
Isn't that setting a dangerous precedent?
Wow.
Now you could distinguish into rabbinic prohibitions, whether it be within one category.
Well, because Rashi is saying that in this case, it's not even considered in the category of a rabbinic prohibition. It's something the rabbi said not to do because it's vadai going to cause a deoraita. Because it's certainly going to be deoraita. That's why. In other words, the rabbi said don't do it because it's definitely going to result in a deoraita. It's not really the rabbanan, Rashi
Three
says.
categories. There's the oraita, the rabbanan, and vadai.
Right, and there's an action that vadai is going to cause a deoraita, so that's what Rashi says.
It's very
So it's not even really a D'Rabbanan. So the D'Rabbanan is when there's a step removed.
Right.
Don't do A because you might come to do B. Here it's like don't do A because most certainly B is going to result.
So what's it called when you could do something that may...
Davar she'eino mitkaven. That's something else.
Well, so isn't this the davar she'eino mitkaven? So you could
not if it's for sure, because here it's so...
If you're actively removing, you know that you're going to remove it.
We're saying it's for sure going to break.
That's what they're saying. It's for sure, yeah. So now the Gemara says, how pulmusa da'ata l'nahar de'ah? So a pulmusa, which is referring to an army came to occupy the area. And because of this occupation, there was no space for the Talmidim to study because
it's the Rebbe's army.
Yeah, the Rebbe's army was having the problem. Actually, the Rebbe's army was the one having the problem because the military army was occupying all the space. They didn't have a place to learn. So Amar lo Rav Nachman said, "Pukuv avidu kivushek v'sheb agma." He said to them, "Listen, go out to the marsh." and crush some reeds so that tomorrow we have a place to sit. We'll sit in the swamp. We have to crush the reeds before Shabbat. You have to make them into seats. So they said to him, wait a second. There is an objection to him. Rami Bar Chama Rav Nachman. Rami Bar Chama raised an objection to Rav Nachman. Rav Ukva Bar Abba Rav Nachman. Some say it was Rav Ukva Bar Abba said to Rav Nachman. Talush v'na'utz in lo tush v'lo na'utz lo. It says in our Mishnah that you can only use a reed that's detached from the ground. How can you just crush the reeds into the ground and sit on them? Because basically what they're going to do is fold the reeds down to make them into a sort of a place to sit. So that you won't have a muktzeh issue, because otherwise it'll be muktzeh, because it won't be designated for normal use. So he's telling them to bend the reeds down into seats. Apparently they're strong. No, he's telling them go before Shabbat and do it.
Well, you sit on the
go
reeds.
before Shabbat and sit on them.
You're sitting on a bent reed. I mean, if you can't even bend the reed, then the best how are you supposed to sit on the bent reed?
You are bending it. In other words, he's sending the students out to bend it before Shabbat. But they're objecting, but they're going to sit on it on Shabbat. So he's asking, wait a second, if you're how can you sit on a reed that's attached to the ground? Isn't it true that you can't put food onto a reed?
Right,
so how can you sit your tachat on it, It's not a good idea.
It's heavier than the food.
Right, for sure. Well, we assume so. Unless you got a lot of food, extra food, not just a lot. Yeah. So Amar Lei said to him, Hatam b'uzardin. Over there, we're talking about hard reeds. So when you have hard reeds, so Rashi explains, they're already hardened. Harehen ke'ilan, they're like a tree. In other words, they can snap. They're hard like a tree. That I'm talking about soft reeds that bend and won't break. They won't break. They're soft. When they're very hard, they'll snap. A reed will snap. When it's still soft, like go to the garden and take a tomato plant, for example. I'm just giving the first example. Try to break it. It's not that easy to break the stem of a tomato plant because it's a soft piece. If it were hard, you'd more easily break it if it's brittle. So he said,
consider breaking if it's detached or if you like.
Even if it's attached.
Yeah.
No, we're talking about where it is attached, because if you break it, it's kotzer. You're actually detaching it from the ground.
Breaking is snapping it out, as opposed to because you could break it, but it stays attached.
If it's mostly detached, that's it. I mean, if it's mostly detached, that's it. Yeah.
Can you break a detached reed?
A detached reed?
Yeah.
It depends what you're breaking it for, but usually you don't break things to size and stuff like that. On Shabbat, no, of course not. It's cutting to size. It's a different malachat. Here we're dealing with the malachat kotzer because you're detaching it from the ground, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So he's saying that on soft reeds you can sit down. First of all, we know that he doesn't want to sit down on hard reeds because that would probably hurt. But he tells him sit down on soft reeds because he says Rashi explains that the rabbis never said you couldn't use a plant. You couldn't put your foot on a plant. They were only talking, or a yarak, a vegetable, because those are soft. They were only talking about things that are domela ilan, things that are similar to a tree that are hard and can break. So here I told the students, let's go sit down on soft reeds, and that's why we're allowed to use them and to sit on them.
But we said a tree can't break.
It could. That's a concern. So it's only a reed that's hard like a tree. So Amarle said to him, ben uzardin, how do we know that there's actually a distinction between hardened branches and unhardened? How do we know that soft and hard, there's a difference between reeds that have already hardened fully and ones that are not, halachically? Detanya, as we learned in the Braita, that it's talking about things that you can or cannot combine in the same field. So he says that hakanin, reeds, atadin, and hegin are different types of thorny bushes. You can have these in the same field as a vineyard, and it's not kilayim bakerem. V'tanidach, but it says another bright hakanin v'akidin v'orbanin, that it says that reeds and kidan and orbanin min yaraken are a type of vegetable, and v'hen kilayim bakerem. And they do constitute mixed, diverse seeds in a vineyard. How do they translate these things? Kida is what? So I can't remember. What does it have as kidan? What is it translated as? Cassia or something like that, right? Does it have, what are these things? Oh, you don't have the place? What's the kidan? What does it say in English? Is it cassia or something?
Kidan. It's a cassia.
Cassia, and what's the other? What's the urbanin? What's the urbanin that it has there? What's that called in English?
Earlier, urbanin.
In the same list. Does it have it?
Yeah. Oh, Hakidan. Okay, so the Hakidan, the reeds, the cassia, and the ogiers.
Ogiers, we don't know what that is?
Ogiers, which is a variety of willows that grow around ponds.
Okay, a type of willow. Okay, so it's a type of willow. Fine. So,
Urbanim, the reeds and the cassia of the ogiers.
right, whatever that is. Okay, so it gave us just about as much information as Rashi did, which is 4 shears. That's all he says. I have no idea what that. Yeah, he doesn't really tell you anything. Okay, so it's a type of vegetable. So the point is that kanim, reeds, are on both lists because reeds are listed as trees that are allowed to be planted or allowed to coexist with in a vineyard, and then it's listed as a vegetable that is not allowed to coexist with a vineyard, to be planted with a vineyard. So which one is it? So that's why Rav Nachman says that Ela Shemamina kan Muzardin, kan Veishen Muzardin, that Shemamina. So therefore you see that there's a difference between soft and hard. When they're hardened already, so that's when we consider them like a tree. So that means that they'd be allowed to be planted together with a vineyard because they're not considered part of the garden. They're just considered trees, and they would be subject to the same gezerot of putting things on them and taking things off of them or sitting on them as a tree would. But when they're soft, they're like a yarak, they're like a vegetable, and therefore they would be considered to be, you would be allowed to sit on them, you'd be allowed to put your food on them, but they would not be allowed to be planted together with the vineyard. So you see a distinction here between soft reeds and hard reeds. So now the Gemara says, V'kida min yaraku, is cassia really a type of vegetable?
Cassia here is a coarse cinnamon bark. It's a seal.
Yeah, Rashi says kidan is bosem sheshmo kidah. It's some kind of a spice called kidah. We know that kidah is from the Ketoret, right? Kidah is mentioned in the Ketoret. So he says, is that really a type of vegetable? But now we learned in Markivin pagam al gabe kidah levana mipnei shu yarak bilan. Says that you cannot combine. You're not allowed to combine pagam on kidah levana. On white kidah. Pagam, how does it translate it as? Here it says roda in Rashi, which I have no idea what that is. Did I tell you what that food is?
Kidah. Oh, the kidah and acacia. Well, and it's acacia, a species of vegetable. The kidah means yaraku.
Yeah, but what is the other thing? The next part. What does it say?
The hatanan. It is. Graft.
No. What's the fruit? What's the other fruit? The pagam or pagam? What is that? Right here. White cassia. You can't. A rue plant. Okay. I have no idea what that is either. Okay. I just wanted to know. So the rue plant cannot be grafted with the cassia levana because it's the white cassia because it's considered to be a vegetable with a tree. Okay, so that means that the rue plant is a plant, and the cassia is not a plant; it's considered a tree.
So it's a mixed species.
Right, so it's mixing the species. So you see that cassia is in fact a type of a tree, not a type of a vegetable. So the Gemara answers that Amar Papa kida lechod ve'kida levana lechod. It depends. There's a difference between regular kidah, which is the one that we talked about as being a vegetable, and kidah levana, the white cassia, which apparently is defined as a tree, not as a vegetable. And that's why it mentioned specifically kidah levana in that case. And we'll continue Bezrat Hashem with the new Mishnah tomorrow.